The river looked peaceful that summer morning in 1891, the kind of quiet that made people believe nothing truly evil could happen there. It moved slowly and steadily between the tall pines, its surface shining like dark glass. Fog drifted above the water in thin white sheets, soft enough to look harmless but thick enough to hide anything lurking beneath. People who lived near the river often said the mornings felt heavier here, as if the land carried memories it didn't want to let go. Most never thought much about it. They were too busy with work, family, and the simple rhythm of life that repeated day after day. The small settlement nearby was nothing more than a scatter of wooden houses, a general store, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, and a muddy road that cut through the middle. Life was quiet, predictable. Everyone knew everyone, and most days passed without surprise. But there were always whispers, old stories the elders shared, strange things they once saw, sounds they couldn't explain. No one took them seriously anymore. People already had enough real problems to worry about. Among the locals were 6 fishermen who spent most mornings on the river. They weren't rich or powerful. They didn't stand out unless you looked closely. But each of them carried their own quiet struggles that the town never fully noticed. They met at the riverbank almost every dawn, long before the sun rose, pushing their worn wooden boats into the water and drifting toward the calmer bends where fish gathered. On the surface, it looked like any other routine, but these men weren't just there for food or money. They carried a kind of tiredness in their faces, the kind that came from life wearing them down in small, slow ways. One of them worked too much because he feared what staying home would turn him into. Another hid the anger that built up inside him whenever he felt powerless. Another avoided going back to a house that was becoming colder each night. They smiled at each other, shared jokes, and spoke like men who were fine, but still something lived underneath their words, something they all felt but never named. Maybe that was why they fished so often. The river didn't judge them, it didn't argue or question. It gave them space. When the 6 of them were together, the air around them always carried a strange mix of silence and tension. Not open conflict, just something tightly held inside. Each man had moments where he watched the others a bit too carefully, as if trying to figure something out. Sometimes the jokes between them sounded light, other times sharp enough to cut. It wasn't enough to start a fight, but enough for the few people who noticed to wonder if there was more going on beneath the surface. The town didn't think much about their group, aside from seeing them as men who kept mostly to themselves. But there were small things that hinted at deeper problems. Arguments overheard through thin walls, sudden coldness between neighbors who used to be close, quiet complaints whispered by wives or sisters or mothers. No one ever stepped in. In 1891, people believed problems inside a home belonged only to the home, never to the town. So whatever each man was facing stayed, hidden behind closed doors. Some of the fishermen had connections that made others tread carefully around them. A relative on the council, a cousin with too much land and too much influence. In a small place like this, power didn't look like something written on paper. It looked like favors quietly given, debts quietly owed, and the silent fear of what could happen if you crossed the wrong person. Even among the 6 men themselves, power shifted in ways that weren't always spoken out loud. One had money. One had respect. One had physical strength. One had a charm that could turn someone's anger to trust in a heartbeat, and the others felt those differences even if no one talked about them. There was one man in the group whom most people trusted without question. He always smiled first, always offered help, always spoke in a soft, calm voice. Yet if someone watched him long enough, they would see moments, very quick, very controlled, where his face went blank like he was thinking of something he didn't want anyone else to know. He had a way of pulling people toward him, making them listen, making them believe he understood them more than anyone else. Some admired him. Others kept their distance. The fishermen seemed to follow his lead more often than not, and he liked that more than he would ever admit. As the summer moved toward July, the riverbank became the place where tension gathered without warning. Someday, the men returned before lunch with full nets. Other days, they came back empty-handed and quiet, barely looking at one another. The townspeople noticed their moods shifting, but they chalked it up to heat, exhaustion, or money troubles. People didn't want to think anything darker was brewing beneath something as ordinary as fishing trips. Still, there were small, unsettling signs. The river had been acting strangely. Animals near the water seemed skittish, running off before anyone came close. A few families living closest to the bank said they heard noises at night, oars dipping in water when no boats were out, or voices whispering low enough to sound unreal. Others saw shadows moving along the surface when the moon was out, shapes too large to be fish. No one reported it. They didn't want to look foolish. The fishermen brushed off the stories, but they felt something different too. They felt it in the way the river seemed darker lately, almost oily in color. They felt it in the odd silence that followed, no matter where they went along the water. They felt it in the way the fog clung to their boats even after the sun should have burned it away. But none of them wanted to be the first to admit it. By the end of June, the air around the river felt heavy, thick with heat and something harder to name. The men's last few mornings together carried an edge that made them keep glancing over their shoulders. Their voices were lower. Their movements are sharper. They stayed closer together on the water as if something unseen pressed against them. Nothing violent had happened yet. No threat. No sign of a crime. Just the slow tightening of something invisible, something waiting. Life appeared normal from the outside, men fishing, families waking up, the sun rising on another quiet day in 1891. But underneath it all, the fragile world the town depended on was already cracking. And none of them knew that soon, the river would send back 6 empty boats, and nothing else. The weeks that followed carried a strange kind of pressure, the kind people felt even if they didn't know why. At first it was small, an edge in someone's voice, a look that lingered too long, a joke that sounded a little too sharp. But slowly, day after day, the tension between the 6 fishermen thickened like the river fog in the early mornings, settling into every word they spoke and every silence they tried to ignore. It started with money, though none of them admitted it at first. The summer had been rough. Fish were harder to catch, markets paid less, and debts piled up quietly in people's homes like unwanted guests. One of the fishermen, Elias, felt the weight stronger than the others. His family had slipped further than anyone realized. He owed the storekeeper more than he could pay, and his wife had begun selling small handmade items to help, though she never said the real reason why. Elias kept telling himself things would get better, that the river would eventually give back what it had taken, but deep down he knew he was running out of time. Another man sensed Elias' desperation and used it without saying he was using it. Had a way of finding weak points in others, pointing at them softly as if he were trying to help when really he was just nudging them in the direction that served him best. He liked being the one others turned to. It made him feel important, powerful in a way he didn't feel at home. His wife had grown cold toward him, tired of his charm that everyone else admired, tired of being the one who saw through it. So when the other men listened to him with respect, he felt something he feared losing, control. The more desperate Elias became, the more leaned in. He began suggesting new fishing spots, ones deeper into the river than the others preferred. When someone questioned him, he'd smile and say the old spots were drying up. He spoke with confidence, as if he alone understood the river's moods. The others didn't fully trust him, but trust was a luxury none of them could afford. Every man needed the catch to survive, so they followed even when their guts told them not to. Around the same time, another kind of tension began growing between 2 others, and it came from jealousy, though both hid it behind forced smiles. Had always been the strongest among them, a man people noticed when he walked into a room. He wasn't cruel, but he had a pride that made him take every slight too seriously. On the other hand, wasn't strong, but he had something didn't. People liked him. They trusted him. He had a quiet way of speaking that made others feel safe. Hated that. Hated knowing people listened to without him needing to raise his voice. One morning after hours on the river with barely any fish caught, made a comment he shouldn't have. He said spent too much time talking and not enough time working. Laughed it off at first, trying to give a way out, but didn't take it. He pushed harder, making his voice louder, calling soft. The other men watched the scene with tight jaws, knowing this wasn't about fishing. It never was, wanted respect and had it without trying. Finally snapped back, telling to stop acting like a child who wants attention. It was a simple line, but it hit exactly where it hurt. The boat went silent, the kind of silence that makes even the river feel still. Eyes shifted in a way that unsettled everyone. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He just stared at with a coldness none of them had seen in him before. After that morning, the group changed, pulled away from speaking to him only when he had to. And though polite, no longer tried to soften moods. Something had broken between them. But the worst tension came from something none of them talked about openly. A secret, not shared by all 6, but enough of them knew it for the air around them to feel poisoned. Months earlier, long before the river grew strange, there had been an accident on the water. A young boy, maybe 12 or 13, had been swimming near the far bend when something went wrong. One of the fishermen saw him struggling but didn't act fast enough. By the time the others reached the spot, the boy had vanished beneath the surface. His body was never found. Officially, it was called a tragedy. Everyone agreed the river was unpredictable, especially with strong undercurrents. But the truth was messier. The man who hesitated, the one who froze instead of helping, had been drinking the night before. He had been warned by others not to go out on the river that morning, but he didn't listen. And the shame of that moment lived inside him like a wound that never healed. That man was Rowan. He carried the guilt quietly, a heavy thing pressed against his chest every morning. The others knew what had happened. Some blamed him, some didn't. But the unspoken judgment shaped every interaction that followed. Rowan tried to hide the drinking, tried to stay sober, tried to be useful to the group, but guilt doesn't leave easily. When he felt someone looking at him too long, he thought they were thinking about the boy. When someone raised their voice near him, he braced himself for an accusation that never came. That fear made him unpredictable. It didn't help that the boy's family still lived near the river. His mother avoided the fishermen whenever she saw them. His father, a quiet man with tired eyes, kept his distance but never stopped watching Rowan whenever their paths crossed. Rowan felt those eyes even when they weren't there. It made him jumpy, quick to anger, and desperate for a sense of belonging that he no longer felt. Noticed that too and used it. He spoke to Rowan in private, made him feel like he understood his regret and made him feel safe. But the truth was darker. Rowan was useful to because he was unstable. Someone easy to manipulate. Someone who could be pushed in directions the others wouldn't go. Never said anything directly, but he planted small ideas in Rowan's mind. Ideas about loyalty, about taking control of their futures, about how the others didn't appreciate him the way they should. While all of this was happening, another problem started brewing. Supplies were going missing from the boats. At first, it was just a small knife, then a coil of rope, then a few fish that someone swore they had caught but couldn't find later. The men blamed forgetfulness, but no one fully believed it. They began watching one another more closely, checking bags twice, counting tools before they left the shore. One evening, after a long day with barely any catch, they argued on the riverbank over a missing lantern. Voices rose fast, louder than anyone expected. Elias, accused of moving his things, fired back, calling Elias careless. Rowan stepped between them, hands shaking, trying to calm things, but his voice cracked in the middle. Tried to reason with them, but watched quietly, not stepping in, almost as if he enjoyed the way they were falling apart. That argument marked the beginning of something worse. Trust had been thin before, but now it split wide open. Every man started keeping mental notes, watching who talked to who seemed restless, who seemed distracted. On the river, their conversations grew shorter. No one laughed anymore. No one shared stories to pass the time. Instead, they sat in their boats with their shoulders stiff, glancing at each other as if waiting for someone to make a wrong move. The river itself seemed to reflect their behavior. It had grown darker, almost murky, even on clear days. Birds stopped resting on the branches nearby. Someone claimed they saw a shape moving beneath the surface, too large to be a fish, too slow to be a log. The men rolled their eyes at the story, but none of them went near the deeper areas anymore unless pushed them to. As the nights grew warmer, strange things began happening on shore. Oars left outside were found standing upright in the dirt, balanced impossibly straight. Footprints appeared near the waterline but led nowhere. The men blamed bored children at first, then outsiders passing through, but deep down they wondered if the river was trying to tell them something, or if their minds were starting to break under the weight of their problems. By July, their relationships had twisted into something complicated and dangerous. His anger simmered closer to the surface. Elias' desperation grew sharper with every unpaid debt. Rowan's guilt made him unpredictable. His patience wore thin as he tried to keep the peace. And smiling, calm, calculating, pulled invisible strings that none of them saw clearly. The final push came when a rumor spread through the town. Someone said the council planned to limit fishing rights for the rest of the summer because the river's resources were dropping too fast. If that happened, the 6 men would lose their only real way to survive. Of course, said he had a solution but refused to explain it fully. He only told the others to trust him, that he had a plan that could fix everything. He said they needed one more trip, one long, deep trip down the river, farther than they had ever gone. The others hesitated. Something in the way he spoke made the hair on their arms stand up. But desperation is a dangerous thing. When a man feels cornered, he listens to the wrong people. He takes risks he never thought he would. He convinces himself that a bad feeling is just fear, not a warning. So despite the strange fog that refused to lift, despite the broken trust, despite the secrets and anger and guilt pressing down on them, all 6 fishermen agreed to follow one last time. None of them knew that this final trip was already shaping itself into the breaking point they had been walking toward for weeks. And none of them could see how close they were to the moment when everything, every lie, every weakness, every silent resentment, would finally snap, leaving only their empty boats drifting back to shore. The morning of the final trip felt wrong from the moment the men stepped onto the riverbank. The air was heavier than usual, thick with a wet heat that clung to their skin. Fog wrapped around the trees like pale fingers, stretching over the water until it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Even the sound of the river had changed. It no longer whispered or lapped calmly. It groaned like something deep beneath the surface was shifting. The men didn't speak about it. They barely spoke at all. Stood at the edge of the bank, his arms crossed as he watched the dark water move. His face was calm, too calm for a morning like this. The others waited for him to explain the plan he had promised, but he kept his thoughts to himself. There was something in his eyes that none of them could read anymore. Whatever charm he once carried had hardened into something colder, something distant. Elias was the first to push his boat into the water. He kept glancing back toward the road, thinking of the debts waiting for him at home, the look on his wife's face when he left that morning, her hands shaking slightly as she tied his lunch sack. He told himself this trip would fix everything. That truly knew what he was doing, but the pit in his stomach said something else, something he fought to ignore. Rowan moved slowly, his hands unsteady as he checked the oars. He had barely slept the night before. His dreams were filled with the face of the boy who drowned, the small hands reaching up from the water, the bubbling scream he could never forget. As the fog thickened around them, Rowan felt that same cold fear crawling up his throat. He tried to breathe through it. He tried to tell himself this trip was just work, just another morning. But deep down, he felt like the river was watching him again. And stayed near each other on the bank but didn't exchange a word. Their last argument still lingered, sharp and bitter. His anger sat just beneath his skin, hot and restless. His patience had worn thin. The hurt from his words had turned into something darker, something like resentment. Neither man trusted himself to speak without making things worse. Once all six were in the water, gave a short nod, and they began rowing into the fog. The river swallowed them immediately. The world behind them disappeared, replaced only by the soft creak of wood, the dip of oars, and the low hum of something beneath the surface. They drifted deeper than they ever had before. The water grew colder. The fog grew thicker. Hours passed, though no one knew how many. Time felt strange here, stretched thin and warped by the river's silence. Eventually, raised a hand, signaling them to stop. He pointed ahead into the fog. "There," he said quietly. "This is where we'll find what we need." The others stared into the blur of white and gray, seeing nothing but moving shapes that could have been rocks or logs or something worse. Elias opened his mouth to question him, but before he could speak, something slammed into the bottom of his boat, a heavy, solid hit that made him gasp. "What was that?" Elias shouted, grabbing the sides. Jerked around, his eyes scanning the water. "Something under us." Leaned over carefully. The river below looked like pure ink, no hints of movement, no shimmer of fish, just a void. Then, without warning, another thud hit Rowan's boat. Harder this time, the wood cracked. Rowan panicked. "We need to go back, this isn't right." Didn't answer. He stared at the water with a strange, fixed expression, like he wasn't surprised, like he had expected this. Elias grabbed his oar, ready to turn back, when a thick ripple spread across the surface. Something large moved beneath them, brushing the boats, cursed under his breath. Tried to steady the nearest boat, but the water began to churn. Not violently, slowly, purposefully, as if circling them. Rowan screamed first. A dark shape rose from the water, not fully visible, just enough to show part of something. Something smooth, something pale, something like a swollen limb or a twisted tree root. It touched the edge of his boat, and Rowan kicked it away in sheer terror. The moment he did, the river exploded into chaos. Water splashed upward. The boats were pushed apart violently. Oars snapped. Elias lost his footing and fell forward, barely catching himself. Swung at the water with his remaining oar as if fighting a living thing. Tried to reach Rowan, who was now half standing in his boat, shaking uncontrollably. "Sit down," shouted. "Rowan, sit." Rowan didn't listen. The guilt, the fear, the years of torment exploded inside him all at once. He screamed at the river, begging the unseen thing to leave him alone, begging for the boy's forgiveness, begging for something, anything, to stop the horror that felt like it had been following him since that terrible morning. Then the river answered. His boat lurched. A force pulled downward, not fast but strong, dragging one side of the boat into the water. Rowan tried to jump into his boat, but his foot slipped. He hit the edge hard and the boat tipped. Reached out, grabbing Rowan's wrist, pulling with everything he had. But the wet wood, the sudden weight, and the churning water worked against him. Rowan screamed, a raw, panicked sound that echoed across the fog. "Don't let go," yelled. "I'm sorry," Rowan cried. "I'm sorry." His hand slipped. Rowan disappeared beneath the water with a splash so deep it sounded hollow. Froze, staring into the dark below, calling Rowan's name over and over. No answer came. Shouted at him to move, but didn't hear. His mind had shattered in that moment, fear, shock, guilt all flooding in. Grabbed by the collar and shook him hard. "Snap out of it, look at me." But wasn't listening. Something inside him broke when Rowan vanished. Elias tried to row toward them, but his boat was taking on water. Still calm, still eerily steady, watched Rowan's last ripples fade, his eyes cold. "He was weak," said quietly. "It was bound to happen." Elias spun toward him. "What did you say?" Didn't respond. He just stared at Elias with a strange certainty. Elias felt something inside him twist. For a second, the fog thinned just enough to reveal his expression clearly. And in that moment, Elias saw something he had ignored for too long, wanted control of them. He needed it. And this trip, this place, this fear, they were all part of something he had been building toward. "You led us here," Elias whispered. "You knew this place was dangerous." His jaw tightened. Danger is what forces people to show who they really are. Heard that, he stepped closer, or raised, eyes blazing. "You brought us out here on purpose. For what?" Didn't flinch, for the truth. Before could swing, another violent jolt hit the boats. The water surged upward, pushing the men apart again. Elias' boat tipped, spilling him halfway into the river. Still shaking, leaned too far and nearly fell. Grabbed him, pulling him back in with brute strength. Then stood. He stood tall in his boat, facing the river like he was challenging it. His voice rose above the chaos. "Enough." The river stilled. Just for a moment, just long enough to feel wrong. Then a wave hits boat, knocking him off balance. He crashed into the water with a sharp cry. The river swallowed him instantly. Elias screamed his name but didn't surface, not once. The remaining 4 men panicked. Elias tried to row backward, but his boat sank another inch. Sobbed openly, shaking uncontrollably as forced him to sit still. Shouted orders no one followed, his voice cracking under the pressure. The river kept pulling at them, dragging, twisting, pushing, like invisible hands beneath the surface were trying to drag them in one by one. Elias lost his grip on his oar. It floated away. His boat dipped dangerously low, tried to reach him, stretching out across the water. "Jump to me," yelled. Elias hesitated. His body was frozen with fear. A shadow passed under him. He screamed. The water surged upward, flipping his boat completely. Elias hit the river with a splash that swallowed his voice. His hand surfaced once, then disappeared, dove after him without thinking. He grabbed Elias' shirt for a second, but the force below was too strong. It ripped Elias from his grasp, surfaced, gasping, shouting his name into the fog. Elias didn't come back up. Saw everything through blurred eyes. His breaths came fast and shallow. His mind was gone, swallowed by fear and shock. He whispered to himself, rocking back and forth. "We're going to die, we're going to die." Climbed back into his boat, drenched and shaking. His arms trembled from the effort. He looked like a man trying to outrun his own rage at the river, at himself for not saving the others. But the river wasn't finished. A deep ripple circled the remaining boats, slow and deliberate, let out a strangled cry, grabbed him again, trying to steady him. "Don't move," said. "Just breathe, we're getting out of here." But didn't hear him. He was staring at something behind. Turned. A pale shape hovered just beneath the waterline. It wasn't a body, it wasn't a log. It was something else, something wide and shifting, something that moved with an unnatural patience. Felt his entire body lock up. Then the shape rose, just enough to break the surface, revealing a form that made the air leave his lungs. It slid upward like a smooth, swollen limb before sinking again, leaving the water swirling violently behind it. Shrieked, lifting his hands to cover his face. In his panic, he stumbled forward and his boat rocked violently. Reached for him, "Don't." Slipped before could grab him. His body fell into the water with a splash that echoed across the fog. Lunged after him, arms outstretched, but all he caught was cold water. Surfaced once, screaming his name, before a force pulled him under so fast he vanished without a trace. Froze, his breath came in shallow bursts. His hands shook uncontrollably. The fog closed around him, thick and suffocating. He called his name until his throat burned, but the river only answered with silence. Now only remained. His boat rocked softly, drifting in circles. The water around him had gone still again, as if waiting. Chest tightened. He stared into the dark surface, knowing he couldn't fight it alone, knowing he couldn't go back. The river had taken everyone, everything. Something brushed against the bottom of his boat. Closed his eyes. Whether it was fear, exhaustion, or resignation, his body finally gave up. His hands slipped from the oars, his knees buckled. The boat rocked once. And then it flipped. Gasped as the icy water pulled him down. He reached upward, fingers clawing toward the faint light above, but the force beneath him was too strong. His lungs filled with burning cold, and the darkness swallowed him whole. When the river calmed, all 6 boats drifted quietly across the surface, empty and silent, as if nothing had happened at all. The fog began to lift slowly, revealing a calm, steady river that looked no different than it had on any other day. The only signs of the chaos were faint ripples fading into stillness, and the 6 empty boats drifting back toward the shore with no men left to claim them. In the hours following the crime, a heavy silence settles over the scene, as if the world itself is trying to comprehend what has happened. The perpetrator stands frozen, their breath uneven, their body trembling as shock floods every corner of their mind. At first, there is denial, an instinctive refusal to believe their hands have caused something so irreversible. Their thoughts jump chaotically, insisting it wasn't real, that the victim will simply stand up again. But reality sinks in slowly and painfully, dragging guilt in its wake. The weight of the act becomes unbearable, causing their hands to shake, their vision to blur, and their chest to tighten with panic. They try to rationalize what happened, replaying moments again and again, searching for any justification that might soften the crushing responsibility now resting on their shoulders. Driven by fear, the perpetrator begins attempting to fix what cannot be undone. They scramble to wipe surfaces, hide traces, and alter the scene in desperate, frantic movements. Every sound feels threatening, the creak of the floorboards, the wind outside, even their own heartbeat. They delete messages, destroy evidence, and convince themselves that covering their tracks might somehow make the situation less catastrophic. But with each action, the guilt deepens, creating a battle inside their mind. One part screaming to confess, the other fighting to survive at any cost. The emotional tension twists into a psychological storm that leaves them feeling hollow, nauseated, and terrified. News of the crime spreads quickly, creating a shockwave that tears through the victim's family and friends. The victim's loved ones are devastated beyond words, torn apart by grief and disbelief. Some collapse into silence, unable to process the sudden loss, while others explode in anger, demanding answers, demanding justice. Memories of the victim surface, laughter, plans, arguments, apologies, each one stabbing deeper into the wound. Friends argue among themselves, searching for someone to blame. Conversations become heated, friendships fracture, and the once close circle is suddenly riddled with suspicion and sorrow. The wider community reacts with a mixture of fear, fascination, and outrage. Social media becomes a breeding ground for rumors and speculation as people scramble to make sense of the tragedy. Posts multiply rapidly, each adding pieces to a puzzle no one fully understands. Some mourn the victim openly, turning them into a symbolic figure of innocence. Others dissect the perpetrator's past, pulling up old photos, messages, and memories to paint a picture of someone they thought they knew. The community, once peaceful, becomes divided, some calling for sympathy, others demanding harsh punishment. Meanwhile, the perpetrator spirals deeper into emotional collapse. Every moment feels suffocating, every breath heavy with regret. Sleep becomes impossible, and when it comes, it brings nightmares that replay the crime in vivid detail. The guilt clings to them relentlessly, breaking down whatever emotional strength remains. Their internal world becomes a battlefield. Fear of being caught, the unbearable weight of what they've done, and the haunting presence of the victim merging into a single, inescapable torment. They question who they were before everything fell apart, and whether any part of that person still exists. As the investigation progresses, pressure on the perpetrator intensifies. Police questions expose small cracks in their story. Evidence begins to surface, each piece forming a noose around them. Friends who once defended them grow distant, unsure of what to believe. Family members become suspicious, noticing nervous habits, inconsistent explanations, and a heaviness in their voice that wasn't there before. The perpetrator feels increasingly isolated, abandoned by the world, and consumed by their own conscience. The community's anger grows, fueled by media reports and public speculation. News outlets highlight every detail, turning the crime into a local sensation. The perpetrator's reputation, once clean or even admired, is reshaped by the narrative emerging online and in conversation. Their worst moments, past conflicts, or hidden flaws are dragged into the spotlight and used to paint them as someone destined for violence. The victim, by contrast, is elevated. Memorial posts, community vigils, and heartfelt condolences transform them into a symbol of loss that everyone rallies around. As days pass, the perpetrator reaches a breaking point. Their guilt becomes unbearable, gnawing relentlessly at their sanity. They stop eating, stop sleeping, and avoid social contact altogether. Their mind becomes their enemy, whispering reminders of what they've done, mocking their attempts to escape the truth. They consider confessing, running away, or doing something even more drastic, anything to quiet the torment inside. But every option feels futile. The consequences appear unavoidable now, looming over them like a shadow that grows longer with every passing hour. The people around them sense the change. Family members demand answers through tears, frustration, or fear. Conversations become confrontations. Tell me what happened. You're hiding something. I don't recognize you anymore. Bonds break under the strain, leaving emotional scars that may never fully heal. And all the while, the world outside grows louder, demanding justice, demanding closure, demanding punishment. The falling action draws to a close with a sense of inevitable reckoning. Evidence tightens around the truth. Public opinion solidifies. Loved ones brace themselves for what's coming. And the perpetrator stands on the edge of emotional collapse, fully aware that the consequences of their actions, legal, social, and psychological, are finally closing in. The crime has not only taken one life, it has destroyed many others in its wake, leaving a trail of grief, suspicion, guilt, and irreversible change. The courtroom felt colder than the river where it all began, colder even than the night the crime unfolded. The air carried a mix of anger, grief, and relief, and each person inside wore the weight of the last few months on their face. When the verdict was read, there was no cheer, no sigh of happiness, just a heavy silence that settled across the room like dust over an abandoned cabin. The perpetrator stood still, absorbing the words they had known were coming. Their eyes were empty, not because they didn't care, but because they had spent every ounce of emotion long before this moment. The sentence handed down was severe, yet it felt small when compared to the damage they had left behind. Justice, in the legal sense, was served, but the emotional damage felt deeper than any jail cell could hold. For the families involved, the verdict didn't bring closure. It simply marked the end of one painful chapter and the beginning of another. The victim's family left the courtroom holding on to one another, each step heavy with the reminder that someone they loved would never come home again. They had waited months for the truth to unfold, and though the truth was finally laid bare, it didn't ease their grief. The empty chair at the table, the unspoken conversations, and the memories that cut deeper each day remained unchanged. Their lives were no longer divided by days of the week, but by before the crime and after the crime, two separate worlds that would never truly connect again. The perpetrator's family was also shattered, though in a different way. They struggled to make sense of how someone they loved could commit something so violent. Some believed there had to be a mistake, others accepted the truth but wrestled with shame. Their world changed overnight. Neighbors stopped making eye contact, old friends stepped back, and community members whispered behind their backs. They lost their place in a town that once felt safe. Even though they weren't responsible for the crime, they carried a burden they never asked for, the burden of being connected to a tragedy they had no hand in creating. As the news spread beyond the courtroom, the community reacted in its own conflicted ways. Social media is filled with opinions, some sympathetic, others harsh. People argued about who was to blame and what could have been done to prevent it. The crime became a symbol of deeper issues that the community had overlooked for years. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about power, control, and the quiet desperation some individuals lived with behind closed doors. The case exposed how quickly relationships could turn dangerous when boundaries were ignored, emotions were manipulated, or past wounds were left untreated. In the weeks that followed, life in the town slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but it never felt the same. The river where the tragedy began no longer felt peaceful. People avoided it, as if the silence there carried echoes of everything that happened. Parents kept a closer eye on their children. Friends checked in on one another more than before. Teachers talked more openly about emotional well-being, and community leaders held meetings to address growing concerns about safety and mental health. The crime had forced the town to admit something it had long ignored. That danger could grow silently in the lives of ordinary people, hidden under calm smiles and familiar routines. The perpetrator, now alone in a cell, faced the consequences in a different way. Their mind replayed everything, not as a way to deny what happened, but as an attempt to understand how they had reached the point of no return. In the quiet of the nights when the world outside slept, they confronted the truth of who they had become. The guilt, once chaotic and heavy, settled into a numb ache that never went away. Their sentence kept them behind bars, but they knew their real prison was inside their own head, filled with memories and regrets that would follow them far longer than their time behind concrete walls. As months passed, the case became a story people told cautiously, with lowered voices and thoughtful expressions. It was not simply a tale of crime. It was a mirror reflecting human weaknesses, jealousy, insecurity, anger, fear, and how those feelings could twist into something dangerous when left unchecked. People began speaking more openly about emotional abuse, manipulation, and unhealthy relationships, recognizing that danger often begins long before the final breaking point. The tragedy became a lesson, though a painful one, awakening the community to the importance of noticing early signs and offering help before something irreversible happened. On a larger scale, the crime drew attention to the flaws in the systems meant to protect people. Lawmakers began pushing for stronger protections, better mental health support, and programs to address domestic conflicts before they turned violent. Newspapers wrote about the case for weeks, focusing not only on the crime itself, but on the deeper issues it highlighted. How power imbalances could slowly destroy relationships, how emotional wounds could fester into danger, and how society often overlooked the quiet suffering of individuals who needed help the most. People questioned their own assumptions about morality, wondering how easily a person could be pushed into making choices they would never have imagined. Even when the public conversations faded, the people closest to the crime lived with the consequences every day. The victim's family learned to carry their grief, shaping their lives around the loss rather than trying to move past it. Some found strength in one another, others struggled to face the world. The perpetrator's family slowly rebuilt their lives, though the shadow of the crime followed them everywhere. And the perpetrator themselves moved through each day with the understanding that their actions had changed the course of many lives, including their own, in ways that could never be undone. The story ends not with relief, but with reflection. It reminds us how thin the line can be between ordinary life and tragedy, how quickly emotions can spiral, and how silence can become dangerous. It shows how justice, while necessary, can never fully heal the wounds left behind. And it forces us to confront the truth that human nature is complicated, shaped by fear, anger, love, pressure, and the dark corners of the mind that many never speak about. In the end, the crime leaves behind a community changed, families broken, and a world reminded that the choices we make, even in moments of weakness or desperation, can echo far beyond what we ever imagined.